The White House is suggesting that Robert Mueller is close to wrapping up his Russia investigation and at the same time distancing Donald Trump from the probe, saying the charges against Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, and a guilty plea by a former campaign advisor have nothing to do with Trump. But others see Mueller's latest moves as just the beginning. Joining us now from Lovettsville, Virginia, John P. Flannery, a former U.S. prosecutor who worked on the Bill Clinton impeachment investigation. Good to have you with us this morning. Thanks.
Good to be here. I defended against the impeachment because there was nothing to it, by the way.
All right, so your background that you bring to the table is fascinating. I want to start with, your thoughts as a prosecutor looking into yesterday's events. What do you believe is Mueller's strategy here?
Well, Mueller's strategy is suspense and very clear destruction in the sense of making cases that will stick. What he did yesterday with Manafort and Gates was to put together a case that is very hard to get around because it's document-ridden, and they followed the money, and they put both Manafort and Gates in a place where every offshore account where the $75 million was placed and all the onshore banks where they put the money and the corporations they put them in are all just put together in sufficient detail. But it also advances the case because it shows the means for this conspiracy was the connections both of these men had with Russia, with the former head of Ukraine, with the party and the nation there. So they were just perfect ways to have a connection with Russia to make the quid pro quo that they did. So it was a pretty dramatic. And if the White House thinks that this is the end of it, that's wishful thinking, because there's still Flynn and Carter Page and others in the lineup that will probably come down in the weeks ahead. We don't know all that they have, but from the public disclosures, it's a pretty damning set of facts.
What do you anticipate as the next move then?
Well, I think that besides doing the stuff that we don't see, which is the grand jury witnesses and subpoenaing other documents and wrestling with the White House for even more information, I think that we'll see another indictment. I would say that Flynn is a strong potential because they have information about him from FISA wiretaps, foreign intelligence wiretaps. And, Carter Page is also tightly. So I expect we'll see more. I think first they'll let this one sort itself out. And yesterday there was a significant plea entered by a former aide in the Trump campaign, Mr. Papadopoulos. And it turns out not only was he admitting that he was trying to set up meetings for the campaign with Russian representatives, he went around making tapes of conversations he had from when he began cooperating until yesterday. And so no one knows who they are, and there's nothing like having these kinds of tape recordings to contradict people. So a lot of people are going to be very anxious about going before the grand jury and saying whatever comes into their head that might conceal their involvement.
How nervous do you think people should be or might be in the White House then, given that there may be these recordings?
I think they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. In fact, last night there was a report that in the White House, Steve Bannon was encouraging the president to ask Congress to cut off the funding for the special prosecutor. The Wall Street Journal, headed up by a very conservative and political group, as opposed to its former legendary indifference to politics and concentration on business, said that Mueller should resign. So the long swords are out, the fight is on, and everybody realizes that this is one of the fastest and most historic investigations since Watergate and may eclipse that.
Well, you allude to the fact that Trump, may or may not Trump try to fire Robert Mueller, but senior members of Congress are saying they would appoint a special prosecutor to try to get around that. But I want to ask you, what about pardons? Do you think that Donald Trump may try to use his power in that regard for people like Paul Manafort?
Well, there's a case involving Arapio who was convicted of contempt, and the president gave him a pardon, and the judge said it only goes so far, so he's letting the conviction stick. Now, if you give somebody a pardon, normally they accept responsibility for what they did, but they also give up their right to refuse to testify because they're no longer testifying and putting themselves at risk in a criminal case. So anybody who received a pardon could be forced to testify in the case or put in jail for refusing to do so and sit there until they change their mind. Several of the people yesterday have other considerations. For instance, Manafort has his wife as participant in one of those dummy corporations they set up in the United States. And so he might be concerned about that and other family members. The same would probably be true of Gates. So it's not just their own body that might sit in a jail and they have to decide to take that risk or not. There are family members and others. Giving a pardon in this chance to avoid a prosecution, I think even the Republicans who have lost their spine, if you will, might find that too much for America to stomach, that a president could do such an outrageous thing. And it would be a variation of what we call the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired the investigator of his misconduct.
Final thought for you. The White House, as you know, is insisting they believe Robert Mueller's investigation is going to wrap up soon. Is there any indication of that?
Absolutely. Well, if it does, it won't be to the advantage of the White House. If he wraps up the investigation, meaning he makes all his final indictments and concludes all his investigations, there will be a baker's dozen of people that are doing a perp walk across the Rose Garden.
I appreciate your insights today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
John P. Flannery is a former U.S. federal prosecutor joining us from Lovettsville, Virginia.